Perfect. As Katie said, my name is Jeremy Homan. I am a consulting engineer with Palo Alto Networks. Essentially what that means is I help customers in the sales cycle understand best practice / reference architecture as it relates to products that I'm a SME for. Those products include public cloud deployments in AWS Azure, as well as Panorama and Global Protect. Now, as customers and or partners, you all can engage the CE community at Palo Alto Networks. You would do so by reaching out to your account team and asking them to then leverage the CE community for whatever it is you're looking to gain more insight and knowledge about. Today, we're going to talk about Panorama, kind of the simplified benefits, why you need it, and how to best leverage it. This presentation is probably going to be best for those folks who might not have Panorama today and are looking at acquiring it, or those who've recently acquired it and or have acquired it but don't think they're fully leveraging it right to its max potential. And we're going to talk to kind of some design concepts around Panorama, configuration management, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this slide, I really want to stress the fact that as of today, customers are leveraging Palo Alto Networks firewalls in a multitude of form factors and locations to safely enable their applications and users, right? So 20 years ago, we might have had firewalls just on-prem inside the data center or at remote office sites. But today our firewalls are all over the place, right? Public cloud, private cloud, remote office, headquarters, and even Prisma Access, right? So we have a multitude of form factors protecting various types of entities. With that, right, we have this kind of conglomerate of isolated firewalls out there in your environment. Now, if we had to manage each one of those firewalls individually, that would be quite cumbersome and quite frankly, probably unachievable, right? A lot of our, depending on the environment the customer needs, a lot of firewall might share configuration across, certain aspects of the firewall, essentially, security policy, address, items, device configuration of the firewall, and having to do that in a repeated fashion could lead for error, right? So we're here to talk about Panorama and what it brings to the table. And quite simply, it does a couple of things, right? Simplified configuration management, manage all of your form factors of firewalls in a single place. Centralized visibility, right? So instead of having to go to each firewall to look at, traffic logs and pull reports and etc., you can do that all from one place. And some simplified operations, right? And we'll delve into each one of those. We're going to start with config management. Again, we're talking about multiple firewalls, multiple users, always evolving, right? In our environment, in our environments, we oftentimes have multiple users managing our environment, multiple requests coming in daily to make changes to our environment, new applications, new compliance requirements, so on and so forth. So it can be, quite a lot going on behind the scenes as relates to managing the firewalls themselves. With Panorama, we're able to consolidate, organize, and leverage configuration in a form that allows the administrator to be much more efficient, right? And one of the beautiful things about Panorama is the consolidation aspect, right? When leveraging device groups and templates, and we'll talk to that here in a moment, you're able to position your firewalls within Panorama device groups and templates in such a way where you can deduplicate configuration across your enterprise. So if you have, lots and lots of remote offices or sites that have commonality between the configuration, i.e. security policy, network configuration, so on and so forth, you're able to consolidate that and have it so that you're not having to make those changes 50 times. You make it one time, and that configuration change will be, pushed out to every single firewall. So within Panorama configuration, there's two real components to this. There's the device groups and then the templates. Okay. Device groups, we're talking about the security policies and objects tab of the firewall, right? So we're going to be managing all of our rules as well as all of our objects, right? Address, service, custom security profiles, anything under those two tabs within a PAN-OS firewall will be under the device groups. As far as template goes, we're looking at the network tab and the device tab of the firewall. Now, not everything under the device tab of the firewall is configurable from Panorama, but the majority of it is. The things that are important are. And we're going to talk to kind of how you might use these two items to manage your environment. So firstly, we'll talk around, optimizing network configuration with templates. So let me actually show a different slide here. My apologies. Looks like it might be out of order. Let me go ahead and we go here. Boom. Slide view slideshow. Okay. So templates, right? Templates by themselves are a bit of configuration, right? And I always use an analogy very much like a hamburger, right? When you have a hamburger, you have all the individual ingredients. You have the tomato, the lettuce, the cheese, the hamburger, the bun. And by themselves, they're not much to look at. But when you put them together, you make something that's pretty fantastic. And templates and template stacks are effectively the same thing, right? So you can use templates and template stacks to achieve a configuration that allows you as a customer or consumer to manage your firewalls more efficiently, okay? And one of the things that you might look at or you might think about when creating and managing templates and template stacks is to consider device function and role within the environment. Okay, so when I say device function, what I essentially mean is what are our like devices, right? And like devices might share configuration. Okay, on the right hand side here, you can see we have a bunch of various different templates. Now, these are just examples. Every enterprise will have its own kind of requirements and considerations as it relates to what they might need from a template hierarchy, but these are just some examples here. And then on the left-hand side, you can kind of see, our template stacks, which consist of multiple templates that are then positioned and then delivered down to the firewall. So when you're thinking about your environment, and when I speak to my customers, I oftentimes say, think about like function and where configuration might be common amongst different firewalls. And I'll give you an example. So earlier I had said, if you have a lot of remote sites and or if you're in public cloud, multiple regions, right, different sites, but you can leverage templates to deduplicate the amount of effort that is required to configure those firewalls. And what I mean by that is you can essentially have a network configuration template that has all of the network interfaces, right? Network interfaces, virtual router, that configuration configured leveraging something called variables. And because we use variables, we're obfuscating the actual, data from the template and variabilizing it, allowing us to then take that data and apply it at another location. So, and we'll talk about that here in a moment a bit more, but effectively what we have is we can take, a single template that has variabilized interfaces, variabilized next hop routes, these items, and we can push that down to many firewalls. And when we push it down to many firewalls, what we end up with is the same single template or template stack with variables being pushed to 10 or more firewalls. And on commit, we can apply the variable data to the template as it's being pushed onto the firewall. So then the firewall itself gets the unique data it needs in order to function. And I will show what that might look like here in a second. Let me go back here for a moment. Oh, my apologies, wrong button. I want to go here, share. I want to go to this slide here, view slideshow. Okay, so if we click here, we can see that you can take ETH1, for example, within a template, and instead of applying an absolute value like an IP address 10.10.11 to ETH1 in a given template, you can give it a variabilization $ETH_IP, ETH1 IP. Now what happens and what we see is within the template, we'll see that variable, right? And we'll reference that variable. But what'll happen is when we go to apply this template stack to a device or we apply this template stack to multiple devices, we're able at that time to give that variable a meaning or a value that is unique to a firewall. So instead of having 50 templates or network templates for these remote offices that are seemingly identical in configuration, you can have one template with variables leveraged that then you push out to all 50 sites, and it allows you to deduplicate the amount of effort that goes into managing all of those sites. So we're gonna take a moment now and talk about device groups. Okay. So with device groups, we have a parent-child kind of hierarchy, right? When it comes to configuration, the utmost device group is shared. Anything put in shared that resides in shared will be fed down to all of its children device groups. And then subsequently, anything you create under shared and anything you create under those objects will then share data. So in this example here, when I create branches and I create data center, if I create a bit of data within data center, that configuration is not shared to branches. That configuration is only shared to its children, and it's not shared to shared unless you create an object and you want it to be shared, you check the box, okay? So when thinking about device group hierarchy, it's extremely important to plan out kind of your environment in a way that makes sense to you and your organization. And I always, when I talk to customers or when I meet with customers and we're discussing Panorama, and if they're interested in looking at Panorama, we're having like a design session, I will say that this is probably the most important part of the exercise, is to sit down and draw this out, right? I see that there are questions here. Let's see here. We'll go ahead and answer them now as we go through, since they're relevant to what we're speaking about. Real world example to template with variable, and when you assign the actual data for a specific firewall. Sure. So oftentimes in public cloud, and I'll use public cloud since I'm also a public cloud CE. In public cloud, you might have a stack or a set of firewalls, right? 2 or more firewalls that are effectively the same interface configuration, same virtual router. However, they have unique IP addresses, okay? And instead of having to manage multiple templates within Panorama, one network template for each firewall, what you would do or could do is configure a single template, right? A single template called Azure Region 1 Network, network firewall template or something along those lines. And inside that template, you could then build configuration using variables that then get dispersed out to each individual firewall. So what that might look like is like such. And let me, I have an instance of Panorama open here. Katie, would it be appropriate to also, as I'm giving the presentation, demo some of this content?
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share a different screen. And we're going to go to share. Here we go. Okay, so this is an instance of Panorama that I have. And inside this Panorama, I have some example templates and template stacks. But when it comes to public cloud, and I'm going to pick on public cloud because that's what I speak to most. When it comes to public cloud, we oftentimes, again, have multiple firewalls that have the same kind of network configuration, but they're just kind of in this high resiliency available, group. So it might look like something like this, right? Where we have multiple VM series firewalls, and they're identical as far as interface configuration, ETH1, ETH2, virtual router, etc., except for the fact that the IP addressing is unique per VM. In Panorama, what that might look like is something like this, right? So instead of adding slot 1, ETH1 with a, an IP address like, 1.1.1.1, we might do something like this. Well, we'll hit untrust IP. And we're going to give it some kind of, null IP address, something that we recognize as, hey, I need to go in and change this. So I'm going to put an IP address there, slot 1, ETH1, untrust IP variable. I'm going to click OK. Okay, so now we see here, untrust IP, boom. So I'm going to add another interface, slot 1, ETH2, and I'm going to do the same thing, but this is going to be for the inside. Okay, and I'm going to call this one trust IP. So I'm going to go here, and let me give it trust IP. I'm going to give this a different IP address. Okay, so now what we have here is we have this network template, right, that has two interfaces configured, ETH1 and ETH2, and with variables as the IP addresses. Now, this template will be a part of a template stack, right? So if I go to my templates here, I can see that I have these templates, Azure Pool 1 and Pool 2, and then Stack 1 and Stack 2. These templates will be part of a template stack. When assigning a template stack, or when assigning firewalls to template stacks, you can do it a couple different ways. You can have multiple firewalls assigned to, and I don't have any added to this instance of Panorama, I apologize. You can have multiple firewalls assigned to a single template stack, or you could have a firewall per template stack. Now, ultimately, it's up to you. I will mention that Panorama has 1,024 device group and template and template stack limit. So keep that in mind when building device groups and template stacks. But what's common is such. Folks will have multiple firewalls assigned to a template stack. And then at the stack level and or at the firewall level, when it's added into Panorama, you can adjust the variables, the data that's applied to the variable. So for example here, and I'll just show this because we can showcase this, I can go here and manage these variables. You see here, these variables have a green icon on them that say, hey, they're learned from somewhere. They're learned from the template Azure Pool 1. I can override these variables and give them an actual value. So this is my untrust. I might give it something like this. And then this being my trust, I can give it something that's 10, 2, 0, 1, 32, or 24, it doesn't really matter. But what we have here now is we have a template that we can use in multiple places, right? Because we're obfuscating the actual data, the IP data, and we're variabilizing it. Now we're applying that template to a template stack that subsequently gets applied to a firewall. And at the template stack and or the device level within Panorama, we can change the variable value, right? So instead of being that default value of 1.1.1.1, we can give it something specific, right? So in your environment, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, it could look a couple different ways. Okay, so that's kind of an example of how you might build and configure a template with a variable. What if there's a conflict? So local or Panorama template, which setting gets applied? Good question. If you have configuration that's local on the box, it takes precedence, right? Now, what I recommend or what I urge customers to do to think about is, depending on where you are in your journey, if you have an environment where you have lots of firewalls and you're adopting Panorama, reach out to your account team, and get time with someone like me, because there is a way to ingest existing firewalls into Panorama and then have Panorama take control of that data and then push that data back out to the firewalls. Ideally, in a perfect world, I would like to see everything managed by Panorama, right? One place to go for all your configuration management. You don't have disparity between, hey, where does this live? Is it on the firewall? Is it in Panorama? That creates confusion, which creates problems. Panorama managing everything equates to a simple life, okay? Now, we will talk about config priority within Panorama, and it differentiates between template stacks and device groups. So within a template stack, we have an allotment of templates that we can apply to a stack, right? So here you see, here are available templates, pool 1, pool 2, that we're applying to this stack, okay? The template at the top of the stack has the highest priority in presence of overlapping configuration. This is important to know. When you're building your configuration, this is important to know. Anything that exists in the first template will be king or queen, and nothing will be able to override it. That is not the same for device groups. In device group land, the thing that's closest to the firewall, i.e. the firewall might be assigned to this device group here, takes precedence, okay? So templates and device groups and how the configuration behaves, there's some differences there. So it's important to be mindful of that. And Mike, I think we answered your question. The variables are generated at the template, then you define the values within Panorama. So you can define the values at the template stack if you have like a one-to-one relationship. But if you have a many-to-one, what you might do then is manage the variables through a CSV at the device itself. So if I had firewalls inside here, you see there's a column for variables. You can manage all of the variables per device from Panorama. Okay, let's go back over here. Great question so far. So again, when talking about device groups, I always urge the customers to take time and think about how we want our device group hierarchy laid out. This is where a lot of the meat and potatoes exist from a lot of customers, right? They leverage, most customers, oddly enough, leverage Panorama, for device groups only. Now, again, I recommend that we use Panorama for everything, albeit all configuration. However, sometimes I'll see customers use it just for security policy. And if that's the case, and that's okay, let's try to get to the point where we're using Panorama for all configuration of our firewalls. But it's really important to take the time, think about the structure of the org, where we want configuration, what makes most sense for our enterprise, and work through that kind of that data flow. If we do this ahead of time, it'll make life on the back end a whole heck of a lot simpler. Okay, let me do this. So here we're showing, local versus central control, right? When we have Panorama, you can still make changes local on the firewall, right? You can still make changes local on the firewall. I would say don't. However, if you need to, you can. So there's this notion of pre, local, and post rules, right? So any pre-rules are rules generated in Panorama that are pushed down to a firewall. Any local rules are rules that are local to the firewall. So like device rules, if someone logs into the firewall itself and creates a policy. And then post rules are rules generated within Panorama that are pushed to the firewall and will append themselves to any local rules that are generated on the firewall. Oftentimes, when working with Panorama, I'll tell customers to create everything as a post rule. Create everything as a post rule. And the reason being is it gives you the ability to, if you had to in a scenario, troubleshoot something or you needed to make a change, a quick test, you could create a local policy as a local admin, right? I know that that contradicts what I just said about don't ever create anything local, but would be one of those break glass scenarios. If you were to create everything as a pre-rule and you needed a break glass scenario to create a local rule, well, guess what? Your pre-rules would always supersede those local rules. So if you needed to create a rule to test something really quickly or to fix something, it wouldn't take effect if you had a rule above it that was breaking that traffic. When will we see any device rules that is in the firewall? Someone that configured something locally and not in Panorama. What to do if we need to import those device rules? Well, so what I recommend when adopting Panorama or when going to Panorama is to think about our user access control, right? And limiting access to local firewalls and kind of granting it only through Panorama. Now, essentially what I'm saying is make it apparent to our administrators that they should not log into the firewalls for anything other than troubleshooting, i.e., they need to look at the session browser, right, to look at active sessions to troubleshoot something that's happening, and that anything that needs to be created from a configuration perspective needs to happen from Panorama. When configuration is pushed down to the firewall, it has a different color to it, right? There's a background hue to the color, so you'll be able to clearly see what is local to the firewall and what source is from Panorama. We do have a demo Panorama, Palo Alto Networks does. It's currently down. Um, uh, I'll reach out to the PM to see if we can get that up and running so you can have a little bit more visibility to like an active Panorama with lots of data and configuration behind it. But you'll be able to clearly see what's local, what's not, so on and so forth. Do you need to remove the local rules after Panorama is used to manage rules? Great question, David. As part of the ingestion process, we have you do that, right? So if we have a firewall that's currently locally managed and we want to manage that solely from Panorama, part of the process is to ingest that configuration in Panorama, then push and commit and override any local configuration on the firewall, right? So i.e., we remove everything locally on the firewall and everything will be managed solely from Panorama. And here we're showing, hey, from Panorama, same look and feel to security policy, right? We can build rules and push rules down to firewalls that you're used to today, logging directly into the local firewall. Same look and feel as it relates to security profiles. Nothing is really different from a device group. The contents within device groups, creating configuration and pushing that down to the firewalls. And these are some slides to show you that and talk to that. Okay. As well as rules, we can still do, EDLs. We can create and manage EDLs from Panorama, right? All of the contents that are local within PanOS, you can do from Panorama. My apologies. I think Zoom disconnected my audio for a moment. MindMeld is a tool that you can use to manage EDLs, custom EDLs. And then finally, within Panorama, tagging, right? So you can use tags and tagging groups as a way to better manage your entire security policy, right? And that's extremely helpful too when managing security policy within PanOS and Panorama. Tags allow you to quickly identify sets of rules applicable to a certain thing, whether it be like a change request and or a business application or a business unit. I suggest always use tags if and when you can. Here we're going to talk about RBAC. RBAC is extremely important within Panorama because RBAC allows you to create access for users and then customize that access based on what they need. And a use case might be as such, right? So if you have auditors that come in your environment every so often and they need access to Panorama, but they don't need commit access, they don't need access to certain sets of firewalls, they don't need access to any of the logs, they just need access to the policy. Using the admin roles, you can go in and essentially turn on and off all of the elements in which you want that user to have access to and not have access to. And we can get pretty granular when it comes to RBAC. So they can have access to certain device groups, certain functions. You don't want them to have access to the API or command line, you can turn that off, so on and so forth. So for large enterprise, even small enterprise, if we have folks that are in charge of certain firewalls, you can create RBAC so for those folks for their certain responsibilities. Committing. So this is always an important thing to talk about when talking about Panorama and kind of this flow and function. When you're working in Panorama, Panorama itself is a config management tool, right? Panorama itself does not stream its configuration live to the firewalls 24/7. That's not how that works, right? So Panorama itself has a configuration, and you can make many changes and edits and saves or commits to that configuration and keep that configuration local to Panorama without ever making a change to a firewall, okay? So there's two functions. There's commit to Panorama and then commit to firewalls, or commit and push, right? Commit and push is the 2-in-1, where you are doing both at the same time. But what I want to stress is that when making changes in Panorama, I always recommend that we do it the two-step process, right? If we make a change to Panorama, we want to first commit to Panorama, right? And then here we can see a list of all the current pending changes. It's always important to preview changes, right? You can look at context of all the changes. Hey, what's happening? What's actually being changed? Depending on who's working in Panorama at the time, you can see, okay, this is exactly what I expect to be changed, right? Based on the configuration changes I made. Beyond that, you can validate your commit. But I always suggest customers commit to Panorama, and then after you have successfully committed to Panorama, then push to your devices, right? Reason being is commit and push, while it's a great tool or a function, if you're not careful and if other folks are doing things and you accidentally commit everything, right? So if we go to commit Panorama, we can see commit all changes, commit changes made by me. You can get yourself in some trouble. So it's best to commit to Panorama first, preview the changes, and then push down to the firewalls. Now, save does not commit. What we're doing is saving is like a temporary thing, right? We're going to save our configuration, right? But we're not going to commit it to running. So we can save an instance of this configuration, but that configuration won't be considered running within Panorama. Setting up Panorama on AWS, Azure, or on-premise, is there benefits or concerns with cloud-based Panorama as opposed to on-prem? Not at all. right? And quite honestly, as more customers adopt kind of like that cloud first, story, where you put Panorama solely depends on, hey, do we have an instance of Panorama today? If not, and you're making a move to the cloud, or you have cloud presence and you want to run virtual instances of Panorama, you can literally run it anywhere. One thing to keep in mind is Panorama needs to run when doing HA. Both instances need to be on the same hypervisor, meaning if you want to do HA, both have to be in AWS, both have to be in Azure, both have to be M500s, both have to be VM instances running in your data center. Okay. Tom, I'm looking at your question here. How can we leverage Panorama cleanup to use objects from managed firewalls without using Expedition? So, great question. Policy Optimizer is great for rule sets. For objects, I don't. So for objects, there's kind of a long-winded way to do it, and it comes down to the search function, right? You can global find certain things, right? And with global find, you'll have to quite simply manually go through the process of searching for objects, finding if they're used or not, and if they're not used, remove them, delete them. Expedition is a tool that I swear by. Before joining Palo Alto Networks, I was a consultant for a consulting company for a long time, and I probably have, I don't know, a couple hundred migrations under my belt. And day in and day out for years, I leveraged the migration tool, which is now known as Expedition, and I used it for absolutely everything. So for things like cleaning up unused objects, I say Expedition without a doubt is the gold standard for that process. And then, Tom, you can always reach out to me directly afterwards via email. We could talk a little bit more about that, thoughts and concerns and whatnot. Okay, let me go back to the presentation here. Again, here I was showing that the search function, right? So we have the search function. So if you're looking for something within Panorama, you search the entirety of the Panorama context. So not only stuff specific to a particular firewall or device group, but all the things. Okay. Another thing I want to talk about is centralized visibility, right? This is important, and we're going to kind of speed through this for the sake of time. But when we have lots of firewalls, right? If we don't have Panorama, when we want to look at things, we want to troubleshoot items, we want to look at log data, we have to log into each and individual, every firewall to gather that data. With Panorama, all of that data is streamed to Panorama so we can access it in one place, okay? So rule usage, right? Visible within Panorama, right? We keep track of that. Baseline usage and resource utilization tracking. This is important. I think this came out in maybe 9 code, but over time, Panorama will gather a baseline of what your firewall consumes from a resource perspective. And then if you have moments where your firewall starts consuming way more resources, it'll be considered a deviation, an event, and you'll be alerted on it, right? So it's super cool and a useful tool when you have lots and lots of firewalls, and all of a sudden one day one of your firewalls, instead of the data plane is now like 70% utilization, when typically it runs at 20 to 30%, you get notified, hey, what's going on? I need to go take a look at it, right? So anytime there are deviating devices, you'll see them within Panorama under the Panorama tab, and then it allows you to say, okay, what's going on here? What's the actual deviation? What am I looking at? Is there similar baseline usage tracking for Panorama as relates to what, Tom? Like just the Panorama overall CPU utilization? You can leverage third-party monitoring tools, like if you have like SolarWinds or something to grab SNMP data from Panorama, right? That's probably what I would do. But overall, Panorama Panorama technically is kind of like an offline tool in the sense that if it were to go down, not necessarily detrimental to the environment unless we're doing things with plugins and so forth, in which case it's very much an online tool. But oftentimes what I would do is just leverage some kind of monitoring tool and monitor the CPU utilization of Panorama, right? If we have lots of administrators, making changes daily, right? We add lots of firewalls. We start, the log ingestion rate of Panorama goes up. Then we're going to want to be, okay, what do we need to do to bring this down, right? Add discrete log collectors, add additional, make changes, so on and so forth. Logging, again, when we have Panorama, all the logging gets forwarded to one centralized place. So if we're troubleshooting, items between multiple remote sites, right? If you didn't have Panorama, you'd have to open up site A, site B, you try and correlate the logs yourself. But with Panorama, you can look at all logs from all sites at the same time. So when searching for source and destination IP addresses across your traffic logs, you can see all the things. The ACC, right? I love the ACC. When ACC was changed in 7.0 to what it is now, it's absolutely fantastic. ACC and Panorama is the same thing as PanOS, but again, we're seeing our entire environment, right? So all the data put into this pretty visual for you to then leverage and look at for your needs. Same thing with reports, right? Now we can build reports and automate reports based off all the data from all the firewalls that we have in our environment. I don't know how many of you use ACE, but again, with Panorama, right, correlation now across our entire environment instead of having just that one single set of firewalls. And here's what that might look like. Simplified operations, right? So with Panorama, you can do quite a bit of things. Create policies that automatically adapt to changes. There is something within Panorama that's called address groups. Within address groups, you can make an address group what we call dynamic. Dynamic address groups can be created a couple different ways. A common way is through the use of plugins like the Azure plugin, AWS plugin, VMware plugin, where the plugin will go out to your environment, your hypervisor environment, scan for resources, and then scan those resources for any associated tags. Those tags it scans and learns about can then be consumed and positioned within device groups, or not device groups, but address groups that then are leveraged in security policy. So for example, here you see our compute resources have these tags. We have that address groups or subsequent dynamic address groups with a set of tags created. So any for New York web servers, any object that has New York tag, web tag, or Linux tab, add that resource to this address group. Then we reference that address group in security policy. So what that allows us to do is to streamline kind of some of, what I tell customers is like the simple services. So DNS, NTP, LDAP, things that resources need when they come online, you can streamline that by leveraging dynamic address groups and tagging through either the plugin or doing it manually through API interface with Panorama. This is pretty big in public cloud. With public cloud, oftentimes we tell customers leverage plugins, right? The plugin environment for Panorama is growing, and constant changes being made. Leverage those plugins to streamline operation. Share screen. I don't know why that stopped sharing. Okay. Forwarding, right? What we learn from Panorama, we can forward to elsewhere, right? So sometimes what we'll tell customers is, maybe they have like a long-term syslog collector, right? Which is great, right? cold storage for, we have to keep this data for 6 months, fantastic. However, still use Panorama as kind of the intermediary, because you get to take advantage of reporting within Panorama, ACC that's in Panorama, troubleshooting capabilities that are within Panorama. And then from Panorama, you can take that data and then forward that data onto any other destinations you'd like. Automation, right? Automation is huge. It's a buzzword that's constantly happening these days. How to automate, why to automate, right? Through Panorama, we have tons of integrations with other partners and vendors, where you can take advantage of some of their capabilities. For example, Aruba, ClearPass, right? Cisco ICE. We have integrations that if we see, or if they see a bad actor, a bad behavior, they can, through the API, update Panorama, which updates an address group with, an address object with a tag, and then subsequently that address object no longer has internet access based on security policy that you might have. Automation is huge, especially with Panorama and some of the capabilities we can do. Use the power of the API. Again, API. Now, I will tell you that Panorama is an older technology, right? So it can at most have about 10 API calls at a given time ran against it. I don't know if there are plans to expand on that. So instead of running lots and lots of small requests or pulls or gets, make them larger, right? Update and upgrade easily. Managing Panorama, upgrading Panorama is a pretty simple process. Through the GUI, you can pull down dynamic updates, software upgrades, so on and so forth. And then scaling, right? So Panorama can run in a couple different modes. Panorama mode, which is management and log collecting, management only mode, or log collector mode. And then depending on your environment and what your requirements are, we would design for, hey, what are you trying to accomplish, right? Most oftentimes, large enterprise, they'll have management instances of Panorama as well as log collecting instances of Panorama to achieve their goals. And this is just some of the models that we have with Panorama, virtual appliances, hardware appliances, and the logging service. I'll wrap it up there since I'm 1 minute over time. Any additional questions I could be able to answer for anyone? Yep. If there are, please reach out. I'll stick around and answer questions for the next little bit. If you need to engage a CE, please reach out to your account team. We have CEs for all of our products and services. So not only Panorama, public cloud, private cloud, Prisma Access, any one of our products and services, we have a consulting engineering for. So if you want to learn more about architecture design, best practices, please do engage your account team. That's what we're here for. We spend every day doing these types of things. So with that, I appreciate your time. We have a couple minutes for break. Thank you so much.